Hi, everybody. Michelle Edmonds here from Idaho News 6. So glad you can be with us for Making the Grade. We're having a Wednesday edition for you because so much happened yesterday in the Idaho legislature. We have to get you caught up on what is happening from the State House in education and budgets all the way to all those bills that have been passed or not passed. We have a lot to talk about. Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News joining me once again. Kevin, yesterday, we can now say, after what happened in the Idaho House, the public schools education budget is in limbo. There has been no movement from the House except to say, not going to happen. In a 34-34 vote, I believe it was, tied vote, it failed, and this was a major section of the education budget. So we're talking about the K-12 public schools budget that has to be passed before the legislature can leave for their second renewed session here. $2 billion we're talking about, and they couldn't pass basically half of this yesterday.
Right. So the biggest piece of the K-12 budget is the budget that goes towards teacher salaries, and that was what the House voted down on Tuesday. So we're talking about a little bit over $1 billion, so more than half of overall K-12 spending in this one bill, which died on a 34-34 vote. Your civics lesson here is that a bill needs majority support to pass either the House or the Senate, and that did not happen on Tuesday. And the debate, and it was a pretty wild debate, and it centered on this whole issue of critical race theory and social justice, which has become this defining issue in education this legislative session. Concerns from some conservative legislators that they want assurances that K-12 teachers are not instructing kids in critical race theory or social justice topics. So what they want, in effect, is the budget bill to come back with language making it clear that this is not going to be taught in the classrooms. It's a new chapter in what's becoming a very polarizing debate at the State House about education policy and education spending. This is becoming kind of the new norm. We saw the higher education budget fail on the House floor a week ago. We saw the new version of the early education grant program barely pass the Senate on Monday, and I know we're going to get to those later on in the segment, but this has become sort of the recurring theme of education funding debates at the State House this session. And really, who knows where this is going to end and how this is going to get resolved.
If you're just joining us, you're joining us for Making the Grade here live on Facebook and Idaho News 6 social media platforms. We'd love to take your thoughts and questions. We're starting off hot with the education budget being in limbo still. Kevin, here's my question for you. Curriculum in Idaho is decided at the local level. School districts decide what they teach. So why is the legislature sending this bill back to JFAC over curriculum?
Well, that's a really good question. And you are right that curriculum is set at the local level. 115 school districts, dozens upon dozens of charters, they figure out which kind of curriculum they want to set as aligned to state academic standards. So that's a really good question. Why is this intent language, why is this within the legislature's bailiwick? It's not academic standards per se, which is part of the legislature's bailiwick. Curriculum, it really is a local decision. It's been a local decision for years. I mean, that's been the tradition. That's been the practice. So yes, this is a bit of a departure if you look at it that way.
What is JFAC going to do?
Rewrite the budget. And that's what they have to do. And that's what they're going to wind up doing. My guess is that you probably won't see a whole lot of difference in the numbers, because really the debate on Tuesday wasn't about the numbers. It wasn't about, are we putting too much money into the teacher salary bill? That wasn't the sticking point. So what I would imagine is we will see JFAC, which has a lot of work to do, by the way. They still have to rewrite a higher education budget as well, come back with some sort of a budget for the teacher portion of K-12. I don't expect the numbers to change much. They have to change the numbers slightly. It's part of legislative practice, if you rewrite a budget bill, it has to come back with a different number. $100. It might be the difference in a $1.1 billion budget, but they have to do something different numerically in order to satisfy the requirements of the process. But the big thing will be, what does this language look like in terms of critical race theory, social justice, education topics? That's going to be the big change, and that will be the focus of debate when this bill comes back before the House. And if it passes the House, then it has to go to the Senate, or if it passes the Senate, then it's got to get over the House. So I think that's where your debate's going to be.
I was really interested in hearing from Representative John McCormack, the Democrat from Garden City, because he is a teacher. When he was debating on this bill on the House floor, his basic quote that you have quoted here at Idaho Ed News, we used at Idaho News 6, his soundbite, so to speak, was that especially this year, in the midst of trying to teach via remote, that there's no time for teachers to even begin to think about the idea of a social justice agenda or critical race theory agenda. And he argued pretty strongly for that point for teachers all across the state. Was he listened to?
Well, judging by the vote, he was listened to by maybe about half of the House, because again, this thing failed on a tie vote. I think that his points and the points that we're also hearing from the education groups about the timing of this, the message that it sends to educators, and how it affects the process of negotiating teacher salaries. This is a very sensitive political issue. We've seen this in past years. We saw it back a decade ago when then Superintendent Tom Luna was pushing his reform legislation, which ultimately was voted down resoundingly by Idaho voters. When that was seen as an affront to teachers, when it was seen as an attack on teachers, that became a very politically volatile proposition. If this is seen or perceived as an attack on teachers, it becomes a very volatile issue again, because I think what we saw 10 years ago with the debate over propositions 1, 2, and 3 is that people like their local teachers. They generally feel very good about the teachers in their local school, in their local community, the teachers that their kids have. Then it becomes a very, very volatile political issue.
So what happens when the lieutenant governor says that she's going to launch a task force to look into, quote, indoctrination happening in our schools? How is the education system somehow getting all wrapped up in politics?
We don't really know what the task force is going to look like. We don't know who's going to serve on it. We don't know what the process of the task force is going to be. We don't really know if, at the end of the day, does this task force what happens with whatever the task force comes up with. I mean, it's not a binding group. It's not a policy-making group. It's not like a legislative interim committee or something like that might have an avenue to present legislation in 2022. I don't really know what we can expect from this task force. I think the fact that this task force is being formed it underscores how politicized this issue of what's happening in the classrooms from early education through K12 and through higher education, how politicized this issue has become. I go back to the debate over propositions 1, 2, and 3. This is about as bitter and polarized a debate in education policies I've seen since then.
Let's go to higher education then, Kevin, because it seems if you've been joining us for Making the Grade over the past couple of months, we've been talking about, specifically when it comes to Boise State University, the social justice issue and lawmakers railing on President Dr. Marlene Trump about what's happening on the university. A lot of half-truths being said inside the legislature, but half-truths become real truth when they don't fund a higher education budget, which is exactly what's happened now. So there is a whole slew happening, as you said, not only K-12, but all the way through higher education that has all kinds of different people making points about what's happening at the State House right now when it comes to higher education money.
Yes, and a lot of voices in this debate. You talked about the House vote. 13-57 was the roll call on Wednesday when the first version of the higher education budget came before the House. And you got to remember, this is the same budget that passed the Senate easily back on March 17th, way before the pandemic forced the legislature to go into recess. So here we are, a version of the higher education budget rejected overwhelmingly on the House floor. We still haven't seen what's going to happen in terms of a new higher education budget bill. I mean, we talked about how the teacher salary bill might be different and how the difference may be more in the language, in the legislative intent language. I think when you get to the higher education budget, the dollar figure is probably going to be significantly different than what we saw. I think there's going to be a fairly significant push to cut that budget back from where it was, because what the budget was in its first iteration was pretty close to what Governor Little had recommended back in January. Way back in January, it feels like a year ago. But I expect that the Budget Committee is going to be under significant pressure to come in with a significantly lower number in an attempt to appease the conservatives on the House floor, who want to see a real reduction in higher education funding commensurate with what they believe to be happening on campuses in the way of social justice policy. So that number is going to be worth watching, and that number ties into what we're going to see discussed by the State Board of Education Wednesday afternoon, and that's student fees, student tuition and fees. Now, if you remember, the four-year institutions froze tuition and fees for this year. And all four of the university presidents, college and university presidents, have basically said that the budget that failed on the House floor would have allowed them to freeze tuition and fees for a second consecutive year. Now, if they come back, if the legislature comes back with a much lower number, on the order of several $1 million or more, it'll be interesting to see how that affects fees. And it's going to really be interesting to see what the State Board does today, Wednesday afternoon, when they start to discuss student fees, because the wording in their news release is pretty careful. It said they're going to discuss tuition and fees. It didn't really say they're going to set tuition and fees. I'm not sure if they're going to want to set tuition and fees when it's unclear what the higher education budget looks like. But who knows? We'll watch the State Board this afternoon to see what happens.
Well, you had the opportunity to speak with University of Idaho President C. Scott Green and get his take on what's happening at the State House. What did he have to say? Well,
I didn't talk to him, but he sent out a very, pretty strongly worded letter to alumni and business leaders saying, you need to step up. You need to speak up on behalf of higher education funding. A pretty forceful letter from President Green, calling out, not by name, but certainly calling out by inference, the Idaho Freedom Foundation, the conservative group that's been at the heart of this whole social justice backlash, saying that this is a group that really does not want to fund a university system. They don't want to fund a public education system. That's not what they want. And really pushing for the business community and for alums to step up and say it's time to fund higher education. And I will note that even as we speak, just earlier today on Wednesday, Idaho Business for Education came out with a statement signed by, I think, more than 100 business leaders around the state, urging the legislature to fully fund higher education. So it would certainly appear that Idaho Business for Education, they got the message from University of Idaho President C. Scott Green. I mean, this may have all been in the works all along, but the business community is stepping up and saying, yeah, it's time to fund higher education.
Kevin, I liked your thought process when you were saying that you haven't seen a debate this confrontational since 10 years ago with the Luna laws, as they were well known, and we covered those back then. But talk a little bit about how what's happening on a political front in education could really get at the heart of what the governor has said he's been wanting to do and trying to do, what the State Board of Education has been looking to do when it comes to setting goals for education, specifically getting more students to go on after high school. So now you've got business leaders crying out saying, we need to make sure we have a workforce who's ready to work and stay in Idaho. This has almost an octopus feel to me, with all the tentacles trying to grab at different parts of this kind of political game now. Does it feel that way to you?
It definitely feels like it's some of the most intense debate over education policy that I've seen in years. And it really isn't a debate about dollars. I mean, I guess at some level on the higher education budget, it's a debate about, well, how much are these colleges and universities really spending on social justice? Is the $409,000 that the first higher education budget, is that cut from Boise State's budget? Is that significant? Is that sufficient? Does that fully cover social justice programs? Critics say no, there's much more money going into these kind of programs. So there's a dollar debate, but it is an ideological debate, and it's becoming a very fierce ideological debate. And I'm hoping to talk to the governor. I put in a request to talk to the governor about his take about these budgets and his take about this debate. And we're working on it. We hope to get an interview with the governor. We put in the request, and because I think you go back to the beginning of the session. The governor made his education budget recommendations, and at this point, the higher education budget, it's going to come back probably looking quite a bit different than what the governor recommended in the first place. The K-12 budgets, maybe the dollar figures don't change all that much, but maybe there's intent language that the governor may or may not be comfortable with. We don't know. This early education program, which is a priority of the governor's, is also in limbo. It barely passed the Senate. It goes to the House. The House rejected the first version of it. Who knows what happens when the House votes on it a second time around? Yeah, it's a gnarly, complicated, and very, very, fierce debate right now over education policy.
And what it all wraps up to be is the legislative session is just going to continue, because none of this can be just passed off until next year. These budgets have to be set, and they're now stuck back in JPAC.
When I talked to Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder a couple of weeks ago, and I did this from a podcast a couple of weeks ago, he said that he thought that the work was, and he thought that when the legislature came back last week, that it was about 2 weeks worth of work, and he was hoping to see an adjournment on April 16th. Well, that's Friday. And I'm here to tell you, that ain't going to happen. I don't think anybody expects that this legislature is going to adjourn. I don't even know if next week is realistic. This could go well into the last week of April. And, when you start killing budgets and you start rewriting budgets, it takes time to come back with a second version of the budget. It's just, it gums up the works. Whether you like what's being done here with these budgets or not, it does slow down adjournment significantly. And I ought to note that, the legislature still hasn't come up with a consensus approach to tax relief. That's another big issue that legislators want to get resolved. You do have a transportation funding bill that's working its way through the legislature. So it's not just the budgets that have to be passed, and they do have to be passed, and they will be passed at some point, but it's tax relief and it's transportation policies that legislators want to address before they leave town. It's this whole separation of powers issue between the legislative branch and the executive branch that lawmakers want some resolution on. So there's still a lot on the docket that they're working their way through. We're going to be here a while. There's no question about it.
If you're just joining us, it's Making the Grade. Kevin Richert from Idaho Education News, idahoednews.org, the place to go to read up on all of these stories. You can download their app and get his podcast there as well. Kevin, let's talk about a bill that actually has passed both the House and the Senate.
Yeah, imagine that, right?
There is one so far that we can definitely talk about. This is the vaccine elimination bill. Talk a little bit about what this is and what it could do if the governor signs it.
Well, what it does is it sort of codifies something that is already happening. So we've talked about vaccines, we've talked about vaccine exemptions before. Let's do the quick recap. It's kind of a misnomer to say that Idaho requires kids to get vaccinations. That's what the law says. In reality, that's not what happens. Parents can opt their kids out of vaccinations really for any reason. They can simply turn in a note to the school and say, we're not getting our kid vaccinated. And that's sufficient. That's allowed under the law. And the exemptions have been in place for as long as the vaccination requirements have been in place, which goes back to the late 70s. Idaho has one of the highest vaccination opt-out rates in the nation. That's what we have right now. So what this bill would do, and it goes to the governor's desk now, is it would require school districts that in any communication with parents about vaccinations, that they make clear that parents do have the right to opt out. There was really significant debate on the Senate floor about this bill, even though it wound up passing by a 30-5 margin, pretty wide bipartisan support for this bill. There was concern significantly. The chairman of the Senate Health and Welfare Committee, Fred Martin from Boise, debated against the bill, saying, vaccines are critical, and I'm worried about, does this compromise the message about the critical importance of vaccinations? And we're talking about the battery of childhood vaccinations that have been around for years, whether we're talking about mumps or rubella or whooping cough. And we're not even talking about the COVID-19 vaccination, but obviously that's the vaccination that's on everybody's minds. What Senator Martin was talking about, and what I think a lot of the debate was about, was the importance of those vaccinations. And really nobody on the Senate floor said these vaccinations are bad. There's no anti-vax sentiment expressed on the Senate floor on Tuesday. It was really more of a question of, are we giving parents the information that they're entitled to under the exemption policy? So that bill goes to the governor's desk. It's gotten widespread support in both houses. We'll wait and see what he winds up doing with it.
Was this a precursor to a possible debate over whether or not to require the COVID vaccination for high schoolers, or even if and when a vaccine is approved for children, to add that to the list of quote unquote requirements for Idaho vaccines? Because as you well said, anybody can opt out of having their child vaccinated. But was this the precursor?
Yeah, I think there was certainly an element of the COVID-19 vaccination debate when this came up in committee last week. Lori Dan Hartog, Republican from Meridian, who's one of the co-sponsors of the bill, expressed concerns about heading off the potential for a COVID-19 vaccine mandate, which I find to be a little bit far-fetched. Not only do we have the language in place for childhood vaccinations already, which already allows opt-outs. You had Governor Little last week come out and say that his administration will not support or allow, via executive order, will not allow the state or any public entity in the state to require a vaccine passport. Now, the passport is kind of a catchphrase, but I think that extends, by my way of thinking, a prohibition on vaccine passports would extend to any kind of mandated vaccine in a public entity, which would include a school district, which would include a public college or university. I mean, by my way of thinking, this is non-lawyer Kevin Richert interpreting what I think the vaccine passport means. So really, I don't think we're going to have a mandated COVID-19 vaccine in Idaho, in the public sector in Idaho. I could be wrong, and I could stand to be corrected on that, but I don't see that happening.
Let's talk on another bill that has actually made its way to the governor's desk as well. You and I have mentioned many times here about advanced opportunities, money that high school students can tap into in order to pay for any kind of advanced learning. This could be maybe taking an advanced placement test. Maybe this is taking a college level course, that there is now literally a bank account set aside by the state for each high school student to be able to tap into so that families don't have to burden those costs. The whole goal here, again, is to get more high school students thinking about going on to college or a post-secondary professional certificate after they leave high school. But this Advanced Opportunities Bill changed a little bit of that, right, Kevin?
Yeah, so this provides a smaller chunk of money for private school students to tap into an advanced opportunities program, similar to what public high school students and charter school students have been doing for several years. A little bit lower, a little bit smaller line item, and a lot lower cap on how much of a line of credit, if you will, that private school students would have. They would have $750 to put into an advanced opportunities program. Public school students, charter school students, they can spend up to $4,100 of state money, $4,125 to be exact. So it's a lot smaller, a lot more modest expansion of the Advanced Opportunities Program. The bigger expansion in terms of dollars, the governor's budget calls for putting 20 into advanced opportunities next year. The current line item is $20 million. That's part of the budget that came out of the budget committee earlier this year. That's in another budget bill. If and when we get all of the K12 budgets passed, we'll see if the $29.5 million line item survives. I suspect it probably will, simply because there's been a lot of legislative support for the idea of advanced opportunities over the years. So, we'll watch this private school advanced opportunities bill as it goes to the governor's desk. And again, like we've been doing with everything else at the State House, we're going to keep a close eye on all these budget bills.
One you do not have to keep an eye on any longer because it is dead for the session is all-day kindergarten. There was probably, if you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, but as far as I can remember, the most significant push, the most realistic push for all-day kindergarten and funding it in the state of Idaho than we've ever seen before, but it's just not going to make it through this session.
Significant push, Michelle, but it came so late in the legislative session that it's really probably not surprising that the bill petered out early on in the process. It never made it to either the House floor or the Senate floor. Betsy Russell from the Idaho Press reported about this over the weekend in her column that, as she quoted Lance Cludd, the chairman of the House Education Committee, he said, it just really just kind of ran out of momentum. And you could kind of almost see that coming. There was a push to try to get a full hearing on a full-day kindergarten bill right before the COVID recess. That hearing got canceled. The bill went into a rewrite process. We never really saw the rewritten bill emerge in a committee. I don't think the issue is going away. I think that there's a significant groundswell of support for full-day kindergarten, and a significant groundswell not just because there's a belief that this is valuable for students, that young kids need more time in kindergarten, learning to read, learning math, getting prepared for what awaits them. But I think there's also a belief at the State House that this is something the state should fund, so that local property taxpayers aren't having to cough up the money, which is what's happening in a lot of school districts. A lot of school districts are going to their voters, seeking supplemental levies with the idea of putting, quite a bit of that money into all-day kindergarten to supplement the funding that they get from the state. Because right now the state only funds a half a day of kindergarten. Schools can do more. They just have to figure out how to pay for it. This bill would have given school districts more latitude to use more state dollars for full-day kindergarten. I don't think that concept is going to go away. We'll watch and see what happens next year, but not this year.
And you had mentioned it a little bit ago, but there's an early education grant that is still out there in limbo. This is $6 million essentially in grant money coming from the federal government that has been awarded to Idaho, but Idaho cannot use the money for early education until it gets approved by the legislature. And this, as you wouldn't necessarily think maybe $6 million of federal money would be, but this has become a hot topic.
It really has, and it's become, again, another debate over curriculum and social justice and indoctrination is the word that keeps getting tossed around pretty freely, frankly. This early education grant passed the Senate on Monday on an 18-17 vote. So with no votes to spare, this passed. And, the debate was really about, what is this grant going to do? What kind of early education programs are we going to see? What's going to happen in the communities? The supporters are saying, hey, this is just about teaching kids to get ready to read, to get ready to do, kindergarten level math. Opponents are concerned that the money could be used to push for much more of a social justice curriculum in the early education at the early education level. So this is where the debate has become mired. This bill still has to pass the House, and this is where it all started back in March. The House voted down the first version of this budget back the first week of March. The Budget Committee came back with a new version of the grant bill and tried to put language in that was designed to head off some of this backlash from conservatives, making clear that this is not about curriculum, that these curriculum decisions, to the extent that you've got an early education curriculum in a childcare center or a preschool, those decisions are made locally. Even with that language, as you can see, it barely passed the Senate. It could face, tough going again in the House. No timetable clear on when the House will take this bill up.
We also saw some protests on the State House steps after it failed the first time. So I'll be curious to see if there's some rallying around this kind of in this last minute hour to see if they can't get this passed. And we'll continue to watch that at Idaho News 6 and, of course, at Idaho Ed News. Kevin, before I let you go, two things I want to do some shout outs to. Reporter Sammy Edge has done a phenomenal job this week covering a topic that is honestly near and dear to my heart, which is mental health, and particularly mental health with students, how mental health is going in the schools. And she was able to get a grant and is doing a week-long series. So if you haven't had a chance to go to idahoednews.org and check out Sammy's reporting, it's really good because it gives such a wide range of where students and teachers and administrators are. And it almost kind of started with COVID, but that's not necessarily exactly where she went with every single piece.
Yes, she's done an amazing job of really humanizing the mental health challenges facing kids. And, it's one thing to talk to the experts. It's one thing to talk to the educators and the counselors who are on the front lines trying to help kids at risk. That's important. And, there's been so much discussion about this mental health challenge that's been, exacerbated by the pandemic. But she talked to students who are dealing with this and parents who are dealing with kids who have been struggling. It really puts a human face on a very important issue. It's amazing work. It's been really must-read material. And I'm going to have a chance on my podcast next week to talk to Sammy in detail about the series and the issue and kind of the making of the series. So I'm looking forward to talking to her more about her work and helping readers see the process that got us to this series. It's great work.
Okay, so that leads me to who's on the podcast this week, Kevin.
Yes. Really excited. This will come out on Friday. Had a chance to talk to Dr. David Pate, the retired CEO from the St. Luke's Health System. And if you spend any time on Twitter, that Dr. Pate has been really analyzing the pandemic in real time, providing some really powerful context to what we're seeing with case numbers, what we're seeing with the spread globally. I mean, he is looking at the global view of what's happening with this pandemic and what's been happening with the variants. And I ask him, some straight up questions. Is it safe to have schools in session full time right now when these variants are starting to creep into Idaho? Is it safe to be doing spring sports? Is it safe to go to graduation when those ceremonies come up? So we talked about all of those issues and more. we're really trying to turn the podcast into more of a weekly interview segment, and it was a lot of fun talking to Dr. Pate about where we are in this pandemic right now, and so we will drop that interview on Friday. Hope you'll listen.
I'll be sure to listen. I'll run while I listen. How do you like that? You as the runner that you are.
Right, and we're trying to get the podcast out by middays on Friday. So if you're heading out of town and you have a half hour to listen to the podcast, it'll be there for you.
Fantastic.
Or while you're running, or while you're on the treadmill, or the dreadmill, is as many runners refer to it.
No. COVID has converted me to an outdoor runner.
Good,
full-time, 100%, which I know you approve of. Finally, I'm there with you.
No, I do not like treadmills. I've never liked treadmills, even before the pandemic. They're an instrument of evil. I'd much rather go out, even in bad weather. I'd much rather be out in bad weather than to be on a treadmill.
Kevin, thank you so much for all you do for us on these segments during Making the Grade, keeping an eye on what's happening at the Capitol and all of the different legislation that is coming forth and going back and forth and coming forward again. So it's been a roller coaster, and I continue to look forward to covering it with you on Tuesdays and Wednesdays right here on Making the Grade. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. We're seeing what you said, and we appreciate you joining us for this segment. Again, if you want to see any of these stories, idahoednews.org, the place to go, and especially go check out Sammy's work as well. Yes. Kevin, have a good week. Enjoy your run.
Thank you.
I look forward to the podcast.
Thanks.